Hello, Olly here. Just before we start the show, may I remind you that the team here at The Week not only bring you this wonderful podcast, they also produce a magazine called The Week. It includes the best news stories, reviews and columns from more than 200 UK and international sources, and you can have it delivered to your door each week. And if that isn't good enough news, I've got a special offer just for you week unwrappers. You can claim 6 free issues and a free moleskin notebook when you subscribe to The Week magazine, just for listening to this podcast. Go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code POD25 to get yours. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code POD25. And now on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 13th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen controversial statues of slave traders being toppled, J.K. Rowling accused of transphobia, and the number of COVID-19 cases in the USA passing the 2 million mark. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Kari, Wilkin, boss man Holden Frith, and the editor of the Week magazine, Theo, Tait. And Holden, you are up first. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Will South Africa call time on drinking?
I noticed over the weekend many more people congregating. I noticed post last week's alcohol sales that some of our beds in our trauma units in our hospitals are starting to fill up with alcohol-related trauma, and that is just not on. We have spent all of this time and energy to make sure that our health response is ready. We fought really hard to make sure that we get level 3 in this province, and now I'm being let down. And we cannot allow this to happen. We've got to make sure that responsibility is taken up. This is a partnership between government and the citizen, and that is responsibility. The golden rules: masks, social distancing, hand sanitizers, and make sure that if you are going to drink responsibly.
Premier of the Western Cape, Alan Winde, talking in a video posted on Twitter. Holden, what is he on about?
Well, what's happened is that hospitals in South Africa are dealing with a big influx of patients this week. Not patients with coronavirus, but people who've been injured in accidents or violence resulting from alcohol consumption. One Johannesburg hospital had to close its A&E department 3 times after being overwhelmed by the number of alcohol-related injuries it was receiving.
And what's suddenly causing this spike in boozing then?
Well, when South Africa imposed a lockdown in March around the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, it also banned the sale of alcohol in an attempt to reduce exactly this kind of problem and to allow police and hospitals to focus on dealing with people who had COVID. That was actually very successful. Murders fell by 63% and hospital admissions for people with serious injuries fell from about 43,000 a week to just 15,000 a week. But it was also very unpopular, and so last week alcohol went back on limited sale, and that's what's led to this influx.
Hold on. I mean, murders fell by 63%. I mean, I know we're talking about South Africa here and they have a high murder rate compared to domestically what we'd expect here. But this alcohol ban coincided with the curfew, didn't it? So we surely can't say the causation of the decline in the murder rate was the alcohol rather than people not being allowed to go out, can we?
No, not entirely. There's clearly a lot of different factors here, but the police and social researchers in South Africa believe that alcohol is a huge factor in murders generally in the country. So they say that just over half of both murder victims and perpetrators have high levels of alcohol in their blood at the time of the offence, and 3/4 of attacks resulting in serious injuries also involve alcohol. At the moment, the curfew hasn't been lifted, and alcohol is only on sale until 5 p.m. on Monday to Thursday. There's no sales at all on Friday, Saturday and Sunday. People still do have to be inside. So the only factor that's really changed, and the only factor that can have led to the recent increase, is alcohol going back on sale.
And Kari, before we get too complacent and think of this as a South African issue, There was a study from Cambridge University about British alcohol consumption this week as well.
Yeah, researchers analysed the 5-year averages for death rates and found that among men aged 20 to 24, deaths are down by 30% in England and Wales since the first week of lockdown. And that's 40% if you discount COVID deaths, because there's fewer car accidents and alcohol-related incidents. And there's been a similar trend in South Africa, not surprisingly. They've also had fewer deaths overall during the lockdown because road accidents and gang violence, as Holden was saying, have dropped.
I guess, as with so much coronavirus, though, Theo, against all of these news stories, there's the economic impact of any adjustment that we might make based on them. And alcohol sales in South Africa and in Britain are a huge part of the economy. And what would it do to South Africa if they said, right, you're not going to sell any booze anymore?
Well, I mean, I imagine it seems to be quite a big market because, according to the WHO, they are the 6th in the world in terms of per capita alcohol consumption. So that's, very high levels. But, I think a lot of it happens in unlicensed shebeens and stuff like that. So I'm not sure what the direct economic effects would be. Yeah, it's I guess these things it's always a balance, isn't it? That clearly, if you look at all these amazing coronavirus figures, there are very strong reasons for keeping people indoors all the time. There's, crime is down, traffic accidents are down, traffic's down, air pollution's down. There are lots of good reasons for doing it. But then also, I guess there are good reasons for letting people out of their houses as well.
But on the flip side, you've got to look at the less direct costs. For example, one of the big factors in the South Africa ban was to try to crack down on domestic abuse. And in fact, South African police say that abuse crimes are now down by 70% year on year. On the other hand, campaigners say that calls to the police force's gender-based violence hotline have increased threefold. So it may just be that victims are unable to file official complaints. But there have been reports across the world of domestic abuse rising during lockdown. And some people do link this to alcohol consumption, which is one reason that has been given for banning alcohol, whether you think that is the cause or not.
Holden, this is your story of the week, right? Underreported implications for all of us. I mean, we're not going to ban alcohol because we've got some headlines saying that it's bad for you. We know it's bad for us. We enjoy it.
Yes, and I do. As I was researching this topic, I was trying to work out what conclusions we should draw from it, because there is just so much evidence of how dangerous alcohol is for us on multiple fronts. The long-term health effects we know about, road accidents we know about, they may be less of an issue here now that we have much stricter drink driving rules, but also the link between violence here is well established too. And yet it just doesn't feel like, I would not want to be the politician who had to recommend a complete ban on the sale of alcohol. And we know as well from prohibition in the US that there are big complications with an outright ban too. South Africa has seen some of that sort of...
From what I know about prohibition, I don't remember it leading to a decline in violence from some of the stories that jump out at you from the history textbooks.
I think that's a correct interpretation. And South Africa has seen a little bit of that sort of problem too, with drug dealers and other gangs trying to get in on the act of illicit alcohol sales, and there have been raids on off licenses and warehouses. So it may well be that some of the sort of extreme reduction in violence we've seen is purely a temporary response to the issue, and that if it was a long-term ban, you would start to see people finding ways of circumventing that, and often with violence. But I think one of the reasons I did pick this topic is I think that the way we've dealt with coronavirus is with press conference every day announcing the number of people who've died from one single cause. And according to the South African Alcohol Policy Alliance, they have in their country 130 people dying daily from alcohol-related causes. There's 7,500 people in the UK per year dying purely from the health effects, if you leave aside any violence resulting from alcohol. And I think if you had a daily or a weekly press conference where these sorts of deaths were being announced, either from alcohol or for any range of causes, you would see much more of a focus on those particular issues and how they might be reduced. As Theo says, there are also often issues with preventing people from taking risks that they might want to take in order to lead a fulfilling life. But I think the coronavirus has given us a lens to look at a lot of existing problems in a very different way, and I think this is one of the interesting areas that shed light on.
I guess though, Kari, when newspapers cover problem drinking, they'll often show a picture of people out drinking, nightclubs, pubs, that kind of thing. And then there'd be an equivalent response when you suggest trying to shut those places down. They're part of the fabric of our culture. But if the hospitality industry's been closed down in South Africa for the last few months, as it has been because of lockdown, then actually this is about the problem of drinking at home, isn't it? Which is something, perhaps, that our government could be doing more about.
Yeah, I mean, anti-alcohol campaigners have warned that in this country, for example, people who weren't drinking so much before, they've actually cut their consumption, according to surveys. But people who did drink more before lockdown have increased their consumption, and they're warning about a sort of a time bomb of alcohol-related disease that's going to follow lockdown. On the other hand, how many pleasures do we have left? And also, research has found that alcohol consumption can have health benefits, which are much harder to quantify.
Oh, go on, give us whatever statistics you have.
I have none. But surely what we really need to do is change our attitudes about binge drinking, and that's such a British thing, to just not to say it's a case of either getting rid of alcohol or not, but just to say, have one glass of wine rather than one bottle. And surely that's what we need to do to re-educate, to get a more balanced use of alcohol.
There aren't the same links between violence and cannabis, are there, as there are between violence and alcohol? I know we don't have the same sort of data, but you can see how, again, this sort of information might be used as part of the argument for a legalisation of cannabis here.
Yeah, and there have been scientific advisors who've made exactly that case. David Nutt, who resigned several years ago, he was essentially arguing that if you were performing the sort of risk analysis you had to with illegal drugs on alcohol, it would be deemed far more dangerous than either cannabis or ecstasy, I think he said too. One thing we haven't mentioned so far is the overall death rate falling in South Africa. So whereas most countries dealing with coronavirus have been looking at excess mortality and comparing the recent death figures with those of previous averages, South Africa has actually had an excess vitality. There are more people alive today because of the lockdown and the response to coronavirus than there would have been if life had continued as normal.
And I suppose as well, it might help clarify, Kari, for people, this story. It might help clarify that alcohol is a cause or a motivating factor in so much violence that society kind of accepts statistically the rest of the time.
Yeah, I mean, to come back to the UK again, I believe that it's more than 7% of all hospital admissions last year were alcohol related. So, clearly it's putting a huge strain on our health services. And that's just, and that's before you get the health problems that result from alcohol consumption. But on the other hand, we're all grown-ups. Maybe it should just be up to us to moderate our consumption and deal with the effects. I think we all have to weigh up what we're willing to sacrifice.
And that's why it's so good of you to have volunteered to go sober for 3 months as a result of these statistics. Kari, you're up next after this. OK, Kari, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is someone doing a job on furloughed staff?
From August, if you're on furlough, it costs your employer. And the knock-on from that will be if employers know that there's someone who they don't believe their job is viable after October, many of them will start to make people redundant from August because that's when it costs them to keep them on furlough. So we're likely to start to see a real spike in redundancies coming over the next few weeks as people go into their consultation processes.
Martin Lewis, a.k.a. the money-saving expert on ITV's This Morning earlier this week. Kari, what's the story?
So economists are warning that we're heading for a glut of redundancies this week because we've just passed the 10th of June deadline to put staff on furlough before the next stage of the government's job retention scheme kicks in. Basically, staff have to have been registered for furlough for at least 3 weeks before the 30th of June. So yeah, these redundancies are already beginning. At the other end of the scale, you've got the Telegraph Media Group this week announcing that it's going to return all of the furlough money that it took from the government and withdraw from the scheme because it stayed far more profitable than expected during the pandemic, and it's reached a really high level of paying subscribers. It reached 500,000 2 weeks ago.
Do you think the Telegraph is doing it for reputational reasons, basically?
Interestingly, yeah, the week before, the Spectator announced it was doing exactly the same. Both of them are owned by the Barclay brothers. And I do, the cynic in me does wonder if this is just a marketing ploy to win over more readers.
Or to counterbalance the inevitable Piers Morgan outrage. I mean, here are two of the richest men in the country. They own these organs that are making money and taking money from the taxpayer. Yeah. Okay, so all of that's very, very interesting, but that isn't the underreported story. The underreported story, I understand, relates to furlonteering. What is furlonteering?
Furlonteering is basically when furloughed workers donate their time and skills to organisations while they're off work. And it was originally set up to help struggling charities, particularly at a time when so many of them are facing funding cuts. And I don't think anyone can really have a beef with that this is a good thing. If you're stuck at home and you're bored, then great, go and help a good cause. The problem is that there's now been an increasing number of startups, especially in the creative industries, that have cottoned on to this and thought, this is a good way to get free labour, rather than paying freelancers to do things, like designing logos or being a social media manager. And there's been a lot of jobs are beginning to appear online being advertised only to furloughed staff, saying, look, come and work for us, you'll get great experience, you'll make connections, it could lead to a future job, we're not going to pay you. And this has created a lot of debate online, on Twitter. Even the top lawyer, Jocelyn Morn, has weighed in saying that the fact you're on furlough from employer A does not excuse employer B from the obligation to pay minimum wage. So clearly coming down on the side against this. And there are arguments for and against the practice.
Oh, good. Otherwise, we'd just be victims of a tirade. Let's explore. What are the arguments for, Holden, employing people on furlough for a volunteer job you could otherwise pay someone for?
Well, I think it's harder to find the arguments for than against, but I think essentially they are that people have expertise they're not using, and that they might actually just want to keep themselves active. They might want to pursue new interests, find small up-and-coming companies that they can give the benefit of their experience to, and learn something about a different area of the industry or a different kind of business. Maybe they've always worked for a very large business, several thousand employees. If they're now working with just a few in a completely new startup business, they might learn skills they wouldn't otherwise have.
It's this conflation, though, isn't it, Theo, of kind of learning and mentorship, which is the problem. Like, it feels to me like you've got to pick a side. Like, either you're saying, you're a middle manager who can't work for your employer at the moment, come to our struggling startup and teach us stuff. That then you can see how that could be marketed as a charitable endeavour, a volunteering act. But then a lot of these adverts are saying, you'll learn all about how our agile and thriving new industry works, which is an internship, and they're not paying for it.
Yeah, I suppose it's like the great argument about internships, isn't it? People exploiting people for no money. And also it seems like there would be quite a lot of knock-on effects of jobs that would otherwise have gone to people now being taken up by people who are being paid by the state. I think I just would say that the last figures I saw, it was 8.4 million workers furloughed and 2.3 million self-employed people taking the equivalent of the furlough scheme. So this is more than 10 million people. There is no way that this is not being abused in literally millions of ways, the scheme. You just can't have a scheme this big and administered this fast without it being exploited and messed around. It's just going to happen. It's going to be a story in the future. That the size of the loans that have been handed out and the pressure on the banks to give the loans, which are guaranteed by the taxpayer, is vast. And we're just going to see it over the years that come. We're going to see how much exploitation was involved in this, I'm sure.
But talking about exploitation is difficult, Kari, isn't it? When you can see that for some people who are at home twiddling their thumbs, volunteering on anything will help their mental health.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, there are, much as I hate to admit it, there are some benefits to what these startups are doing. As Holden said, it's a chance for furloughed staff to learn new skills and make useful connections, especially people who are at the start of the career who arguably are the ones who are more likely to have been furloughed. And it can help startups at a really tough time, and which obviously in turn boosts the economy. But yeah, ultimately, the fact that startups are basically getting free labour funded by the taxpayer, yeah, I think a lot of people are going to have a problem with that. And also, it's really bad for freelancers at a time when, freelancers make up a great percentage of the 3 million self-employed taxpayers who aren't eligible for any form of government grants or government funding. Basically, if more than 50% of your income pre-lockdown was taxed at source, which some companies just insist on doing, you don't qualify for any government grants. But at the same time, you can't be furloughed by that company because you weren't officially employed by them. So you have freelancers who are having to go to food banks, get into horrific debt. So they are basically being abused.
And what about the interns, Holden? There are a lot of graduates now desperately looking for a way into the industry, not least, by the way, the industry that we all work in, journalism, the media, the creative industries. Are there any circumstances under which, however you can justify it, a 45-year-old office manager taking their job because they're bored can be justified when those schemes should be offered to people as their first rung on the ladder?
Yeah, I think that's the big part of the problem, really. And some of the employment agencies that are offering these furlonteering schemes say that they're monitoring the situation. They're making sure that nobody who applies for one is being exploited. But in many cases, it's not actually the person who's applying for the job who's at risk of exploitation. It's the people who would have been doing that job either as a freelancer or, as you say, as an intern, and they simply won't have the chance to compete. And if they are made the offer, then they may not be offered payment, which is a problem generally in internships. But I think it's one that a lot of companies have been trying to remedy. If they now have a pool of 10 million people who are being paid by another company and some of those are prepared to offer their services for free, then it wouldn't really make sense for a small startup to offer an internship instead.
And they're also undercutting, Theo, the people who professionally undercut the usual professionals. You see what I mean? The disruptive people who say, oh, I've got a degree in graphic design, but I'm not going to set myself up as a business. I'm going to offer my services a very competitive rate through a message board. I mean, those people aren't going to get the jobs for 50 quid if they're going for nothing.
No, I mean, absolutely not. I imagine that the effects on that would be quite serious, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I think they probably are, and particularly for people in creative industries. If you look at some of the furlonteering jobs being advertised, they do tend to be a lot of copywriters, graphic designers, those sorts of issues. So if you are trying to run a freelance business in any of those areas, I think you would struggle. There's actually also jobs in financial services and software development, which has previously been seen as a very high-paying and safe area. And in fact, I even found permanent jobs being listed where they were being listed as open to both paid and volunteer workers. So if you were someone who was trying to apply for one of those and asking for payment, I think you would feel that some of your competitors might have an unfair advantage.
Yeah, and also I'm curious whether this qualification that you'd get by helping out at businesses is actually worthwhile. I mean, Theo and Holden, you both employ journalists. If someone approached you and said, I spent 3 months volunteering for a magazine on their CV, would you consider that something that's worth looking at?
Well, I think for better or for worse, I mean, in fact, for worse, the media is there's a lot of people doing unpaid work in the media. And, it certainly is something you look at. If you look at someone's experience, I would rather that they had a job, a paid job, but I'm not going to, if they've done quite a lot of experience on the Sunday Times or the Daily Telegraph or whatever, I'm going to take that seriously.
Yeah, I think any experience is useful, and it strikes me the one way this sort of approach could be good, not necessarily the volunteering aspect of it, but the chance for people to do work experience from home. That cuts out one of the issues I think there is in journalism, which if you are living in London or you have friends in London, you can afford to take on much more lowly paid work, or even a week of unpaid work experience here and there, even though, at the week we've always paid our interns, and I think that should be a policy that's more broadly affected. But it is, even with, if you're paying a sort of stipend, the cost of getting to London and living in London for the period of it can be really prohibitive for people who live elsewhere in the country.
And you mentioned vaguely, Theo, a kind of reckoning that might come for the government on this, after this ends, whenever that is and however you define that. People are going to look back through this period and think what went wrong. Do you think this is something that's going to come back to bite the government? The Chancellor should have been clearer about the furlough scheme, or they should have thought through the implications? Or is this basically just, if anyone's being exploited, it's the companies who are doing the exploiting, not the government?
I think at least people who are doing this are being fairly straight about what they're doing. I would think that we will see much bigger and much more obviously, straightforwardly criminal things being found afterwards, I'm sure.
I think this is also highlighting social injustice across the board, basically. This week also there were new figures from the Office for Budget Responsibility, and they've actually revised down their predicted costs for the whole furloughing scheme from 84 billion to 60 billion, which is quite a cut. And they're saying it's basically, this is probably because it's being, companies are mainly furloughing staff who work significantly fewer hours or on well below average hourly pay. So again, this is just more evidence of low paid workers being hit hardest by lockdown and coronavirus, whether they're being furloughed or sacked or risking their lives as key workers.
I thought when you said there'd been a reduction in the amount that was spent, that might be a good news story to end on. But okay. Theo, you're up next after this. Okay, Theo, you are finishing the show this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
It's a week when we learnt that when it comes to keeping our bathing water clean, Britain is right at the bottom of the class.
Linking land and sea, crisscrossing the countryside, cutting through towns and cities. They're arteries of ecosystems, supporting life as a home and food source. But it's not just wildlife lurking below.
By the time I'd got out, I was draped in wipes, sanitary towels and unmentionables.
Claire Fallon reporting for Channel 4 News back in January. Theo, what's happened this week?
The European Environment Agency put out its annual assessment of Europe's bathing water, and the UK came 26th out of 30. So I don't want to sensationalise this. It's not a total disaster. 2/3 of the UK's bathing waters, which in this case means beaches and lakes, are excellent, which is slightly up on the year before. And most of the rest were good or sufficiently good.
I must say, I'm actually pleasantly surprised by that. 2/3 of the public bathing spaces in England are excellent.
Only 1 in 20 was thought to be poor. On the other hand, we need to be clear about what this actually means. That the EEA measures water quality, but depending on the levels of fecal bacteria that's found in the water. Basically, only Bulgaria, Estonia, Slovakia, Albania and Poland in Europe, which is the EU plus a few other countries, have worse bathing water quality than we do, though we are one of the richest countries in Europe, obviously.
And so, why are our waters so dirty?
The underlying issue is that we have these things called combined sewage overflows, which are part of the Victorian sewage system, and when there's heavy rain, they provide an emergency pressure release, which means that sewage doesn't back up in people's homes, which is a good thing. But what's less good is that it also means that rainwater plus condoms, sanitary towels, wet wipes and human waste, among other things, are discharged directly into our rivers and our waterways.
What would the alternative be if we didn't have this Victorian system as a legacy?
The alternative is that we have to rebuild them, and we put in much better systems. For instance, in London, we're doing this at the moment with a 25-kilometre super sewer, which is going to cost about $5 billion.
How important do you think it is, Kari, bearing that kind of cost in mind? I mean, sparkling beaches would be lovely. It's a very large cost for that.
It is, but obviously, clean water is important both for human and environmental health. And just to put this into perspective, there's almost 16,000 of these sewage overflow systems across the UK. And no one really knows how great the problem is, because water firms are allowed to monitor how much crap they discharge, basically, and they don't have to release any data, real-time data, on how often or for how long these overflows, these releases of sewage into any particular river is taking place. So there is a huge problem, and we don't even know the extent of it, but it's obviously dragging us down. To go back to this ranking, yes, 66% of UK swimming spot and bathing waters were deemed to be excellent, but across Europe it was 85%. Our water's only got cleaner over the years because we were dragged basically kicking and screaming to do so by EU directives, and now Brexit. So what's going to happen?
Yeah, what do you reckon to that, Holden? Do you think, once Brexit is fully enacted, this annual water cleanliness survey, which we'll no longer be a part of, won't have such a role, and we'll just try and wiggle out of monitoring it?
There's certainly fears that might be the case, and the environmental campaigners have severe doubts, I think you could call them, about the legislation that the government has put forward to replace the EU directives on the cleanliness of water and agricultural environmental laws in general. They say that there's far more loopholes in what's being proposed, and that there isn't the backstop of being able to take the government to the European Court. Instead, ministers themselves will be responsible for judging how effective the laws are and taking action if necessary. These are still draft bills, so there is time for them to be amended, and there's a campaign to request just that. And of course, now that we are out of the EU, and once we're out of the transition period, it will be up to individual governments to decide. So if this government, or perhaps more likely a future government, decided it wanted to introduce higher standards, then it would be able to do that. I think one of the bigger questions is whether we will actually be part of this Europe-wide survey. And I'm actually not sure if we know what the answer to that is yet. Norway isn't in it, but Switzerland, which is also not in the EU, is included in the annual survey. I think if we are, that might actually prove more of an impetus to try and raise the standards of water, and exactly. Either we'll be responding to shame, or be attempting to instill some sort of national pride about the beautiful waterways and lakes we have.
I suppose the other political implication, Theo, which Kari mentioned briefly there in passing, is the fact that the water companies are privatised. Does that mean that the data is just a little bit more obscured?
I mean, the thing is that actually the Environment Agency does collect the data, but it collects it retrospectively. So we currently have the figures for 2018, but not for last year. So the 2018 figures tell us that there are 147,000 discharges into the UK's rivers. So it's about an average of about 400 times a day, though realistically, obviously, a lot of this is happening during storms.
Going back to what Theo was saying about the Environment Agency testing, they actually announced in mid-March that water testing was being halted because of, lockdown and coronavirus, just as more and more Brits are swimming outside because they can't access swimming pools and stuff. A campaign was launched to try to get bathing water status for more rivers, and this forces water firms and the Environment Agency to clean up the water. So it's kind of a loophole if you can get this status, and they can't keep discharging rubbish.
I was just going to say about that at the moment, the ones that they assess are only lakes and beaches. So what would be, as Kari said, what would be a really brilliant thing is if we could get rivers that people have swum in for, decades, for centuries. If we could get them listed as bathing places, then we could get them into the figures. So it's a famous case of the River Wharfe in Ilkley, which is a very popular swimming spot, where literally it has a CSO discharging sewage downstream and people get ill from it. Or places like the Windrush, where people have swum for generations. And I think since the government has promised that post-Brexit it's going to be even better on the environment than the EU, this is something they could do. They could list these all as bathing places and assess the water quality, which unfortunately at the moment would in many cases be absolutely awful.
And do any of you know what it is that, for example, Cyprus does so well? They've got 99% of their bathing spots are excellent, or what it is that Poland did so badly at 21.6%.
I do know that in Poland it was actually some sort of statistical issue they had where a lot of the measurements weren't completed. So the Polish government has actually been mounting a PR campaign to try and counter this issue of them having terrible waterways. And they insisted, I think it was in areas where the measurements were completed, they had a 70% rate of excellence. So actually they should have been ahead of us in the table.
How responsible of you to flag that up, Holden. Did you get a free sausage and dumpling supper in return for that?
I'll send in my token. It should be said that these figures do also vary quite a lot from year to year, and it can depend a lot on weather conditions. So storms do tend to lead to more discharges. And in fact, as recently as 2011, 83% of UK beaches were deemed excellent. And at that point, we were actually in the top 5 of the European table. And some of the countries that are now in the top 5 were then in the bottom. So I think, there is a lot of natural variation. But having said that, we have been on a steady downward trend over the last few years.
Would any of you go for a swim in your local lake after this?
I check the one that I go to sometimes, the Hampstead Heath Ponds, and that is good. So that's fine.
But that's not excellent.
No, it's not excellent, but I wouldn't really expect it to be.
Well, all this talk of slurry and sewage discharge has certainly made me hungry, so it's time to pull the plug on another edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Theo and Kari and Holden. Remember, you can listen to our entire back catalogue. It is perfect poolside listening. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. And whilst you're there, remember to give us an excellent rating. As if we were being monitored by the... You get it. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.